Across the grand courts of Europe, behind the jeweled crowns and golden thrones, existed a world often unseen, a world shaped not by politics alone, but by faith, ritual, and quiet conviction. When we think of queens, we often imagine glittering coronations, powerful marriages, and royal decrees. Yet, for the queens of the Habsburg dynasty, their true strength was not forged in political chambers or battlefields. It was found in the stillness of prayer, in candlelit chapels, and in the conviction that divine purpose guided every act of power. The story of the Habsburg queens is more than a tale of dynastic marriages and imperial ambition. It is the story of women who lived under immense pressure, bound by duty to family, empire, and God. Their crowns symbolized political union, but their hearts were bound by devotion. To many, their piety appeared private, a matter of personal faith or religious habit. But in truth, their devotion was deeply public and profoundly strategic. Each prayer, each foundation of a convent, each act of charity carried political meaning. Their faith shaped alliances, influenced emperors, and defined the very soul of the Habsburg Empire. These women turned piety into power. They lived in a time when queens were often expected to remain silent. Yet through their faith, they found a voice that resonated across continents. They prayed not only for their souls, but for the survival of dynasties. They saw in religion not an escape from power, but a pathway through which to exercise it. Theirs was a spirituality that ruled, a devotion that commanded respect, swayed hearts, and shaped the moral order of an empire that spanned centuries. Imagine a world where a queen's morning began before dawn, with whispered prayers and the distant echo of church bells. Her day unfolded in ritual, masses, letters to confessors, visits to convents, audiences with ambassadors. Every gesture, from the rosary she held to the relics she kept in her chamber, carried meaning. Behind her measured words and serene posture lay a woman of deep intellect and spiritual discipline, navigating a world of intrigue and expectation with the strength of conviction. The legacy of these queens continues to echo through time. Their influence can still be felt in art, in the architecture of churches they built, and in the enduring idea that faith and leadership are intertwined. They remind us that history's greatest power is not always loud or visible. Sometimes, it is the quiet certainty of belief that leaves the deepest mark. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we'll journey beyond the crown to uncover the hidden world of the Habsburg queens, women whose piety was not a retreat from politics, but a force that shaped an empire. We'll explore how their devotion became both their strength and their strategy, revealing a story of faith, influence, and legacy that history too often overlooks. The image of the Habsburg queen has often been flattened by the weight of dynastic history. She is remembered as a figure of lineage and alliance, a woman whose marriage secured borders, or whose children carried forward imperial bloodlines. Yet this reduction overlooks the deeper reality that many of these queens were not passive instruments of dynastic strategy, but active agents who shaped their world through faith. Their lives, long confined by ritual, protocol, and expectation, reveal how piety became both a personal calling and a political resource. To understand these women is to move beyond the crown itself, to see how devotion could serve as a subtle yet powerful form of influence within the vast machinery of empire. The Habsburg world was one in which faith and rule were bound together. The dynasty's power rested not only on armies or treaties, but also on its claim to divine sanction. Religion was both the moral foundation of governance and a unifying ideology across diverse territories. Within this framework, queenship offered a distinct path to power. A queen consort, unlike her husband, could not command in her own name, yet she was expected to embody the spiritual ideal of the realm. Her virtue was political currency. Her devotions, her patronage of religious orders, and her sponsorship of churches or charities were acts through which authority was expressed and reinforced. In this way, the personal faith of Habsburg queens became inseparable from the public life of the monarchy. It is easy to assume that the religious lives of these queens were private affairs, confined to prayer and pious withdrawal. In truth, their spirituality was never secluded. Piety was performance as much as conviction. Every act of devotion had public meaning. Every display of humility carried political weight. In court ceremonies, in charitable foundations, and in their dealings with confessors, these women crafted an image of holiness that reflected upon the entire dynasty. Their sanctity validated the empire's mission as a defender of Catholicism. Their prayers became part of the state's ritual of legitimacy. To pray publicly was to rule in another form. The Catholic Reformation intensified this dynamic. The Habsburgs positioned themselves as champions of orthodoxy against the tide of Protestant reform. In such a climate, a queen's piety was not only a personal virtue, but a declaration of ideological alignment. Her visible devotion signaled the moral integrity of the imperial household. When a queen attended Mass daily, confessed regularly, or financed a new convent, she was not merely tending to her soul. She was strengthening the confessional identity of the realm. The boundaries between religion and politics were porous, and piety became a language of governance. For many Habsburg queens, devotion provided a form of agency denied elsewhere. In a patriarchal system that restricted women's formal authority, faith offered a legitimate avenue for influence. A queen could not legislate or command troops, but she could advise, intercede, and inspire through moral authority. Her reputation for holiness made her words persuasive in matters both domestic and political. Through confession and correspondence, she could shape the conscience of the court. The language of piety gave her access to the moral dimension of power, one that kings themselves could not ignore. A queen who prayed for victory, for peace, or for justice was performing a political act in sacred guise. This relationship between devotion and influence can be seen in the way many queens managed their households. The royal household was not only a domestic space but a microcosm of the state. By organizing it according to religious principles, by enforcing moral discipline among attendants, or by choosing confessors and chaplains carefully, queens modeled the virtues that the empire wished to project. Their private chapels became centers of patronage and theology. Through these circles, they influenced the careers of clerics, artists, and thinkers who later shaped broader imperial policy. Thus, piety did not isolate them. It positioned them at the heart of cultural and political exchange. The charitable works of Habsburg queens reveal another dimension of faith as power. Almsgiving, the founding of hospitals, and the support of orphanages or convents were expressions of mercy, but also tools of governance. These acts projected the image of a compassionate monarchy, binding subjects to the crown through gratitude and moral example. Charity created networks of loyalty. Religious patronage also allowed queens to cultivate alliances with powerful orders such as the Jesuits, Franciscans, or Carmelites, who wielded considerable influence in education and politics. By funding their missions or protecting them from rivals, queens embedded themselves in the structures of ecclesiastical power. The spiritual advisors of these women often became intermediaries between court and church. Through confession, queens disclosed their fears and ambitions, and confessors in turn carried these sentiments into the political sphere. Spiritual counsel thus became a form of soft diplomacy. The selection of a confessor was itself a political decision. A Jesuit or Dominican close to the queen could shape imperial policy through subtle moral argument. In this exchange between conscience and power, the line between spiritual guidance and political counsel disappeared. The queen's faith became an instrument through which the state negotiated its own soul. Yet the piety of Habsburg queens was not mere expedience. Their writings, letters, and devotional practices showed deep personal conviction. For many, the court was a place of profound loneliness, and faith offered solace in a world defined by duty. The constant expectation to produce heirs, to mediate family rivalries, and to uphold moral virtue under scrutiny required spiritual strength. Prayer was not only a performance, but a refuge. In the long hours of ritual and isolation, devotion became a form of endurance. Their spiritual diaries, though often lost or suppressed, reveal a tension between submission and self-assertion, between humility before God and the assertion of moral authority within court life. Marriage itself was a crucible for the expression of piety. Queens were expected to embody obedience and chastity, yet many used the moral language of faith to assert dignity and independence. When confronted with infidelity or neglect, a queen could appeal to divine justice and frame her suffering as a form of sanctification. Her endurance became exemplary, her patience political. In this way, personal trials were converted into spiritual narratives that reinforced the legitimacy of the monarchy. A devout queen's suffering mirrored the empire's own struggles, sanctifying its endurance through her example. The education of royal children provided another sphere in which piety shaped the future of the dynasty. Queens oversaw the moral and religious upbringing of their heirs, ensuring that devotion would continue as a political principle. The formation of princes and princesses within a climate of rigorous Catholicism was a strategic act, securing the ideological continuity of rule. Through prayer, catechism, and example, queens influenced the conscience of future emperors and consorts. The empire's claim to divine right was nurtured in the nursery as much as in the chapel. The artistic and architectural patronage of Habsburg queens further demonstrates how devotion intersected with power. Religious art and architecture were tools for the expression of imperial ideology. A chapel built in gratitude for divine favor was also a monument to dynastic stability. The paintings, sculptures, and altarpieces commissioned by queens often depicted saints and martyrs whose virtues reflected their own desired image: humility, courage, and fidelity. These visual statements communicated moral authority to subjects who might never meet their sovereigns in person. Piety thus became visible, material, and enduring. The convent was another stage upon which royal women enacted piety. Some queens, especially widowed ones, withdrew to convents or founded religious houses as symbols of renunciation. Yet even in retreat, their influence persisted. A royal abbess or patroness remained a political figure, her sanctuary a hub of correspondence and mediation. The convent became a parallel court, where spiritual authority could challenge or complement temporal power. Within its walls, women could exercise leadership that the palace denied them. The act of withdrawal itself could be read as a statement of moral superiority, positioning the queen as a figure of uncorrupted virtue amid the compromises of politics. Throughout the Habsburg lands, devotion functioned as a form of communication between ruler and subject. Processions, pilgrimages, and public prayers for victory or plague relief involved the entire body of the empire. Queens often led or sponsored such events, embodying the collective piety of the people. Their participation blurred the boundary between ruler and worshipper, suggesting a shared spiritual destiny. When a queen knelt in public, she performed submission not only to God, but also to the moral expectations of her subjects. Her humility was a mirror of her husband's authority. Together they enacted a divine hierarchy that justified political order. This performance of sanctity had its risks. Excessive devotion could be read as fanaticism, while visible asceticism could undermine the image of regal dignity. Queens had to balance fervor with decorum, spirituality with ceremony. Their faith was scrutinized by courtiers, confessors, and ambassadors alike, each interpreting their gestures for political meaning. To pray too much might signal neglect of state affairs. To pray too little might imply impiety. In such a setting, even silence could be political. The challenge for these women was to sustain genuine devotion within a world that constantly instrumentalized it. The tension between sincerity and strategy lay at the heart of their spiritual lives. Many queens embraced mysticism, seeking union with God beyond the confines of ritual. Mystical experience offered a language of direct communication with the divine, bypassing male mediation. Yet such intimacy with God could be controversial, especially when it produced visions or prophecies that challenged authority. Some queens navigated this danger by framing their experiences within orthodox boundaries, presenting their ecstasies as confirmations of loyalty rather than rebellion. In doing so, they transformed personal revelation into political reassurance. Widowhood often marked a turning point in the spiritual and political lives of queens. Freed from the demands of marriage, they could devote themselves more fully to religion while exercising new forms of independence. A widowed queen regent often governed territories in the name of her children, drawing upon her reputation for piety to command respect. Her spiritual integrity provided moral legitimacy for her authority. The image of the chaste, devout widow reinforced the ideal of virtuous governance. In such cases, piety and power converged completely, with faith serving as both justification and method of rule. The international dimension of Habsburg piety cannot be overlooked. Through intermarriage, the dynasty extended across Europe, creating a network of queens and princesses who carried the Catholic ideal into different courts. Their devotions linked distant kingdoms in a common spiritual cause. Letters between these women reveal exchanges of relics, prayers, and advice, forming a transnational community of belief. This web of pious correspondence functioned as an informal diplomacy, smoothing tensions and reinforcing alliances. Through faith, queens became ambassadors of both heaven and empire. The association between the Habsburgs and Catholic Universalism also gave their queens a special symbolic role. They were seen as protectresses of Christendom, defenders of the faith against heresy and infidelity. Their prayers were invoked not only for personal salvation, but for the triumph of Catholic order. The empire's wars and treaties were framed as expressions of divine will, and the queen's devotion lent moral gravity to these endeavors. Her piety was the emotional complement to the emperor's policy, sanctifying the political with the spiritual. The daily routine of devotion within the court was a theater of discipline and example. Morning prayers, attendance at Mass, the observance of fasting and confession, all structured time around sacred rhythms. This regularity imposed order upon the chaos of court life and reminded all who served the crown of the higher purpose behind their duties. The queen's adherence to these practices was itself an act of governance. By shaping the spiritual tempo of the household, she reinforced the values of obedience and reverence that underpinned imperial ideology. At the same time, the sincerity of these practices gave them emotional depth. The queen's prayers for their children, for peace, or for deliverance from illness reveal the universal concerns of motherhood and humanity. In such moments, the boundary between queen and subject dissolved. Faith humanized power. It allowed these women to connect their private hopes with the collective destiny of their people. This unity of personal and public devotion was the essence of their spiritual leadership. The representation of Habsburg queens in literature and art often reflected this dual nature of piety. They were depicted as saints in miniature, interceding for the realm, or as wise counselors guided by divine insight. Their virtues were celebrated in poems and sermons that linked their holiness to the prosperity of the state. These portrayals, though idealized, reveal how deeply ingrained the concept of sacred queenship was in the political imagination. The queen was not merely a consort, she was the spiritual heart of empire. Yet behind these images lay real struggles. The burden of representing virtue could be crushing. Many queens lived under intense scrutiny, their slightest fault magnified as a sign of moral decay. The pressure to appear holy left little room for personal weakness. Their lives were performances of perfection, staged for God and empire alike. In private, doubt and fatigue often accompanied faith. The very qualities that made them powerful in the public eye, humility, patience, obedience, could become chains that confined them. Piety was both a weapon and a weight. Still, these women found ways to assert individuality within constraint. Through correspondence, patronage, and prayer, they left distinct marks on history. Some were reformers, influencing education and welfare. Others were patrons of music and art, shaping the cultural identity of their age. Their faith inspired creativity as well as conformity. The sacred was not only a domain of submission, but a space of imagination, where new forms of expression and authority could emerge. By turning devotion into action, they bridged the gap between belief and power. The Habsburg queen's relationship with the papacy further illustrates the political dimension of piety. Their correspondence with Rome often concerned the appointment of bishops, the canonization of saints, or the defense of religious privileges. Such exchanges reinforced the idea that queens were mediators between the secular and the sacred. Their petitions and intercessions demonstrated the influence they wielded within the church's hierarchy. A devout queen could strengthen her husband's position by maintaining favor with the Holy See, while also asserting her own role as moral guardian of the dynasty. Over time, the cumulative effect of these devotions shaped the very identity of the Habsburg monarchy. The empire's claim to be the defender of the faith rested not only on military victories, but on the visible holiness of its rulers. The Queen's chapel, her charities, her processions, all contributed to a sacred aura that surrounded the throne. Piety became a form of soft architecture, constructing the invisible walls of legitimacy that held the empire together. Without it, the crown would have seemed merely temporal, lacking divine endorsement. Even as the Enlightenment challenged traditional notions of religion and authority, the legacy of pious queens persisted. Their influence endured in the rituals of court, in the institutions they founded, and in the moral expectations placed upon royal women. Faith continued to serve as a measure of virtue and a source of power. The transformation of piety from private devotion to public responsibility remained one of the most enduring aspects of queenship. Through centuries of change, the image of the praying queen continued to symbolize stability and sanctity. To view the Habsburg queens solely as instruments of dynastic policy is to overlook the subtle ways in which they shaped the moral and political landscape of their time. Their faith was not passive but purposeful, not retreat but engagement. Through prayer, charity, and counsel, they influenced the course of empire. Their lives demonstrate that power need not always manifest through command or decree. It can reside in conviction, in example, and in the ability to inspire. In their piety, these women found a voice that transcended the limits of their station. In the end, the story of Habsburg queens is one of transformation. The crown may have defined their role, but faith gave it meaning. Their devotion bridged the gap between heaven and earth, between the private conscience and the public realm. In their prayers were the echoes of politics. In their politics, the whisper of prayer. They ruled not from the throne but from the altar, shaping the spirit of empire through the language of belief. To see beyond the crown is to recognize that their piety was not an escape from power, but its most enduring expression. The story of Habsburg queens, whose piety became a form of power, cannot be understood without returning to its earliest roots. The moral discipline, devotional intensity, and political subtlety that later characterized their spiritual authority were not spontaneous developments of maturity, but the fruits of careful cultivation from childhood. The empire that demanded sanctity from its queens first planted that expectation within its daughters. From the cradle onward, the Habsburg archduchesses were shaped by a world in which faith was not only a matter of personal belief, but the foundation of identity, legitimacy, and destiny. To be born into that dynasty was to enter a spiritual apprenticeship designed to prepare them for the dual life of devotion and diplomacy that queenship required. The education of a Habsburg princess was inseparable from religion. Her first lessons were prayers, her first teachers the clergy who surrounded her family's court. The household itself was a miniature sanctuary, its daily rhythms governed by the bell that summoned both servants and sovereigns to prayer. Every moment, from rising in the morning to retiring at night, was touched by ritual. Religious symbols filled their chambers, portraits of saints hung beside ancestral likenesses, and the chapel was the most constant setting of their early life. Instruction in reading often began with scripture or catechism. The alphabet itself was introduced through sacred text, ensuring that learning and faith were indistinguishable in their earliest associations. This atmosphere of devotion served multiple purposes. It created not only spiritual awareness but also discipline and obedience, virtues that mirrored the political ideals of the monarchy. The Habsburgs saw themselves as God's chosen defenders of Catholic unity. The upbringing of their daughters reflected that mission. A young archduchess was taught to pray for the empire before she understood its extent. Her confessor taught her that personal virtue upheld the moral order of the world. The very intimacy of her faith was thus bound to the vast responsibilities she would one day bear. From infancy, she absorbed the conviction that salvation and service were intertwined. The education of these girls was overseen by a carefully selected network of confessors, tutors, and governesses. Each was chosen not only for their learning, but for their orthodoxy and loyalty to the dynasty's religious ideals. Jesuits played a particularly influential role. Their emphasis on spiritual discipline, moral examination, and intellectual rigor left a deep imprint on Habsburg piety. They taught the art of introspection and confession, encouraging a habit of self-scrutiny that later gave the queens both moral depth and emotional control. The young princess learned to see her conscience as a realm of governance, as ordered and deliberate as the court she would one day preside over. The Jesuit model of spiritual self-command became a model for political composure. Family example reinforced this education. The Habsburgs were a lineage of rulers who viewed personal devotion as a measure of worth. Fathers and mothers alike presented faith as duty. Queens and empresses of earlier generations served as moral templates for their daughters, their lives retold as lessons in humility, endurance, and sanctity. These stories were not mere hagiography. They were training in identity. A young archduchess grew up hearing of ancestors who had founded convents, championed reform, or guided emperors through spiritual crises. Such tales were not distant history but family memory, shaping how each new generation understood its role. The message was consistent. A Habsburg woman was born to embody virtue in public and to defend the faith in private. Religious festivals and ceremonies offered further instruction. As children, the archduchesses participated in processions, feast days, and pilgrimages that combined spectacle with spiritual formation. These events impressed upon them the grandeur and responsibility of their faith. Kneeling beside their parents before relics or altars, they witnessed how devotion functioned as a bridge between ruler and subject. They learned that prayer could be collective, that piety was also a language of communication with the people. Later, as queens, they would reproduce these ceremonies in their own courts, drawing upon memories of childhood reverence to reinforce their authority through ritual. Even play was shaped by devotion. Dolls were dressed as saints, games reenacted biblical stories, and songs carried moral themes. The innocence of childhood was thus infused with the gravity of belief. Spirituality was not introduced as an abstract concept, but woven into the texture of daily life. This early integration of faith and experience made religion not an obligation, but a second nature. When these girls later entered the complexities of marriage and rule, their instinctive response to difficulty was prayer, reflection, and moral reasoning. The habits formed in youth became the tools of governance in adulthood. Confessors played an especially formative role during adolescence, when piety deepened into self-awareness. These spiritual mentors guided the archduchesses through confession, meditation, and the imitation of saints. They encouraged devotion to the Virgin Mary as both model and protector, emphasizing virtues of purity and compassion. Through such guidance, the young women internalized a vision of femininity that combined obedience with strength. To emulate the Virgin was to unite humility with influence, submission with intercession. This duality became central to their later identity as queens who ruled through spiritual rather than political command. Many archduchesses developed personal devotions that accompanied them throughout life. Some favored the rosary, others the contemplation of Christ's passion, or the veneration of specific saints associated with perseverance or charity. These preferences often reflected their confessor's influence and family tradition. The cultivation of private devotion allowed individuality within conformity. It gave each woman a distinct spiritual character, even as she conformed to the broader model of Habsburg sanctity. This personalization of faith was important, for it allowed them to carry a sense of moral autonomy into the constrained roles of marriage and queenship. The intellectual component of their education also reinforced religious understanding. History was taught through the lens of divine providence, philosophy through scholastic reasoning, and literature through moral allegory. The arts were valued not for pleasure, but for their power to uplift the soul. Music, especially sacred music, occupied a central place in their formation. Singing hymns and attending choral performances trained both emotion and discipline. The harmony of voices was seen as a reflection of the harmony of heaven. In this environment, aesthetic sensibility and spiritual refinement developed together, producing women capable of appreciating and commissioning art that communicated both beauty and belief. The spiritual formation of Habsburg daughters was also shaped by the political geography of the empire. Living among multiple cultures and languages, they learned to associate Catholicism with unity. Faith became the common thread that bound the diverse territories of their inheritance. The young archduchess was taught that wherever she went, the church would be her constant home. This sense of universal belonging prepared her for marriage into foreign courts, where she would represent both her family and her faith. Piety was thus a portable identity, a shield against isolation, and a tool for adaptation. The transition from childhood to adulthood was marked by religious milestones. First confession, First Communion, and confirmation were celebrated with solemnity, reminding the young woman of her growing responsibility before God. These sacraments reinforced her awareness of duty and choice. She learned that grace required vigilance, that virtue demanded active maintenance. The discipline of confession, in particular, cultivated introspection. Regular examination of conscience trained her to navigate the moral ambiguities of power later in life. The same spiritual exercises that guided her soul in youth became the ethical compass of her queenship. Maternal influence was equally profound. Habsburg mothers were expected to model sanctity for their daughters. They supervised their prayers, corrected lapses in devotion, and framed religious obedience as love rather than constraint. Conversations about faith were common, blending affection with instruction. Through their mothers, the archduchesses learned that piety was not opposed to tenderness but could express itself through care, charity, and forgiveness. This maternal spirituality became the foundation of their later roles as moral guardians of court and family. The lessons of the nursery echoed in the policies of the throne room. The presence of relics and sacred art in their chambers further deepened spiritual sensitivity. Icons, crucifixes, and devotional paintings were not mere decoration, but companions in contemplation. The young women were taught to meditate upon these images, to see in them both history and example. The tactile engagement with sacred objects fostered emotional connection to faith. Touching a relic or lighting a candle became acts of intimacy with the divine. Such embodied devotion would later inform their patronage of religious art, as queens sought to recreate the spiritual atmosphere of their childhood within new courts. While their education emphasized humility and obedience, it also encouraged reflection and self-mastery. Spiritual mentors often urged the archduchesses to keep journals of prayer or confession, recording their inner struggles and resolutions. These writings, though rarely preserved, reveal an early awareness of responsibility and identity. They show young women learning to interpret their emotions through moral frameworks, to transform fear into faith and pride into patience. The practice of written reflection fostered a sense of interiority that became one of the hallmarks of Habsburg piety. It was within this inner space that future queens would later find resilience against the pressures of public life. In adolescence, when marriage negotiations began, religious formation took on new urgency. Confessors and tutors reminded the young women that their future roles would test both their virtue and their faith. They were told that their influence would come not from command, but from example, not from ambition, but from integrity. Lessons in diplomacy were intertwined with lessons in theology. They studied the moral responsibilities of rulers, the dangers of vanity, and the importance of prayer as guidance in decision-making. By the time a princess was betrothed, she understood that her union would be more than a personal destiny. It would be a spiritual mission. The farewell ceremonies that marked their departure from home were often deeply religious. Masses of thanksgiving and blessing preceded the journey to foreign lands. The archduchess left her homeland with a rosary, a crucifix, or a relic as a token of divine protection. These symbols served as anchors of identity, reminders of the faith that defined her family and would sustain her in unfamiliar surroundings. The journey from daughter to consort was thus framed as a pilgrimage, a passage from one sphere of service to another. Her carriage carried not only gifts and dowry, but also the weight of a sacred tradition. When these women entered their new courts, the contrast between the spiritual purity of their upbringing and the political complexity of their new lives often produced tension. Yet the discipline of faith had prepared them for such challenges. The patience learned through meditation, the humility practiced in confession, and the constancy trained through daily prayer all became instruments of survival. Their early spiritual mentors had equipped them not with worldly cunning, but with moral clarity. This clarity allowed them to navigate intrigue without losing their sense of purpose. They had been taught that holiness was not withdrawal from the world, but steadfastness within it. The early exposure to religious art and architecture also shaped their aesthetic sensibility as queens. Having grown up surrounded by sacred imagery, they understood the emotional power of beauty. When they later commissioned chapels, altarpieces, or sacred music, they did so with an informed eye and a personal sense of devotion. Their taste was not merely ornamental, but theological. The harmony of architecture, or the balance of composition, mirrored the harmony of divine order they had been taught to revere. In this way, childhood impressions found expression in mature patronage, linking the private education of faith with the public display of sanctity. Family correspondence reveals that even after marriage, many Habsburg queens continued to seek guidance from the confessors and mentors of their youth. Letters to spiritual advisors back home show ongoing dependence upon those early teachers of conscience. This continuity underscores how formative those relationships had been. The faith of childhood was not left behind but carried forward, deepened by experience. The queen's later piety, often visible in their acts of charity and intercession, was rooted in the trust and discipline first cultivated under the watchful eyes of their educators and mothers. The Habsburgs also used religious education as a form of political preparation. By instilling in their daughters a sense of universal Catholic mission, they ensured that marriage alliances served not only dynastic interests, but also confessional solidarity. The princess who entered a foreign court did so as a moral envoy, her virtue representing both family and faith. Her childhood formation thus became an instrument of diplomacy. Her devout demeanor could soften hostility, her patronage of local churches could build goodwill, and her spiritual correspondence could influence religious policy. All these capacities traced back to lessons learned in the quiet discipline of the convent school and chapel. The emphasis on humility, while sincere, also functioned as a means of self-preservation. The archduchesses were taught to temper pride and conceal ambition behind a veil of modesty. This training allowed them to operate effectively in patriarchal courts where open assertion was suspect. Their religious restraint became a strategy of endurance. It enabled them to adapt without surrendering their moral core. In this sense, early piety was both ethical formation and political education. It taught them how to wield influence through patience, persuasion, and example rather than command. The spiritual climate of their upbringing also emphasized suffering as a path to grace. The contemplation of Christ's passion and the lives of the martyrs impressed upon them that pain could be sanctified. This lesson prepared them for the inevitable hardships of dynastic marriage, loneliness, separation, and loss. To suffer with dignity was to imitate the saints. Many queens later transformed personal sorrow into acts of compassion, founding hospitals or supporting relief for the poor. The ability to translate pain into mercy was born from early meditations on sacrifice. Childhood faith thus provided the emotional vocabulary for adult benevolence. The Habsburg commitment to Marian devotion further shaped the moral psychology of these women. The Virgin's image as both mother and intercessor offered a model that blended gentleness with strength. The archduchesses learned to see in Mary the prototype of righteous womanhood, humble before God, yet powerful in prayer. This image guided their behavior as wives and mothers. It informed how they mediated between conflicting interests, soothed disputes, and represented compassion within the court. Marian virtues became political virtues. Through imitation of the Virgin, they embodied the spiritual unity that the empire sought to project. The transmission of faith across generations was thus deliberate and continuous. Grandmothers, mothers, and daughters formed a chain of devotion that linked the dynasty's past to its future. Each generation renewed the spiritual covenant through instruction and example. The continuity of belief provided stability amid the volatility of politics. Even when the empire faced wars, reforms, or crises, the image of the pious queen remained constant, rooted in the same traditions that had shaped her since childhood. The endurance of this model attests to the effectiveness of that early education in molding both conscience and character. Ultimately, the cradle of devotion within the Habsburg household was the foundation upon which the later edifice of pious power rested. The queens who prayed publicly, founded charities, and counseled emperors had first learned to kneel in humility and to listen in silence. Their ability to transform faith into authority began with the discipline of belief instilled in infancy. The prayers whispered beside their mothers became the rhetoric of virtue that later shaped empires. The habits of conscience formed by confessors and tutors became the framework of political wisdom. The gentle insistence of childhood piety matured into the steadfast conviction that defined their reigns. The spiritual world that nurtured the young archduchesses was both intimate and immense. It began with the simple rhythm of daily prayer, but extended to the vast ideal of divine mission. Within that tension between the small and the great, between personal devotion and universal purpose, the Habsburg queens found their strength. They were trained not merely to believe, but to embody belief, to live faith as destiny. The continuity between cradle and crown reveals the coherence of their lives. Every gesture of mature sanctity was the echo of an early lesson. Their queenship was the flowering of a seed planted in the nursery, tended by prayer and matured by experience. To understand the Habsburg queens, then, is to see that their piety was not an ornament of power but its origin. The faith that guided their actions as rulers was born in the quiet chambers of childhood, shaped by the prayers of mothers, the instruction of confessors, and the solemn beauty of ritual. In those early years, they learned that devotion was not retreat from the world, but preparation to serve it. Their later influence, subtle yet profound, was the natural extension of that education. The cradle of devotion produced women who ruled hearts as much as realms, whose faith gave moral coherence to an empire built upon belief. And in this continuity from innocence to authority, from whispered prayer to imperial example, lies the deepest truth of their legacy. That power, when rooted in piety, can transcend the limits of rank and endure beyond the crown itself. The mature piety of the Habsburg queens, formed in childhood and refined through experience, found its fullest expression in the daily rhythms of devotion that structured their lives. The grandeur of the crown was balanced by the constancy of prayer. Behind the public ceremonies of rule lay a private world of ritual that ordered time, shaped emotion, and anchored conscience. Within this disciplined routine, faith became not only a moral compass, but also a refuge. The Habsburg court, with its grandeur and intrigue, demanded composure and endurance. The queens found both in the repetition of sacred practice. Every day unfolded as a dialogue between duty and devotion, between the burdens of empire and the intimacy of the divine. The day of a Habsburg queen began early, often before sunrise. As the bells of the palace chapel announced the dawn, she would rise to greet the day with prayer. Morning devotion was more than a spiritual formality. It was an act of preparation, an alignment of intention with divine order. The queen's attendants arranged her chamber quietly while she knelt before a crucifix or a small altar, reciting psalms and meditations on humility and service. Her confessor might have provided a passage from scripture or the writings of a saint to guide her thoughts. This period of solitude was the still point before the machinery of state began to turn. In prayer, she found the clarity and calm required to face the audiences, petitions, and negotiations that filled her day. After morning prayer, the queen attended Mass, either in her private chapel or in the larger court church. The chapel was the heart of her spiritual life, a space both sacred and personal. Designed with exquisite care, it reflected her taste, her lineage, and her devotion. The altarpiece might depict her patron saint or an episode from the Virgin's life, rendered by the most skilled artists of the time. The scent of incense, the sound of plain chant, and the play of candlelight created an atmosphere of transcendence that separated this hour from the rest of the day. The presence of courtiers and attendants during Mass made it a public act as well as a private one. The queen's composure, her attentiveness, and her participation were all noted and interpreted as signs of moral authority. Her visible devotion reassured the court of divine favor and reminded subjects that faith still underpinned imperial power. The liturgical calendar shaped her daily life as much as political schedules did. Feasts of saints, holy days, fasts, and seasons of penance imposed a rhythm that intersected with the cycles of governance. Lent and Advent were periods of special austerity, marked by additional prayers, fasting, and almsgiving. These practices were both spiritual and symbolic, signaling the queen's solidarity with the faithful across the empire. Her participation in the penitential life of the church mirrored her concern for the moral health of the realm. During these seasons, her court often adopted a quieter tone, with fewer entertainments and a stronger emphasis on religious observance. Thus, even the atmosphere of the palace shifted with the cadence of devotion. Throughout the day, moments of prayer punctuated the queen's activities. Before meals, she offered thanks. Before audiences, she invoked wisdom. Before correspondence, she sought truth. These brief intervals of silence amidst constant activity gave her a sense of continuity and control. They transformed ordinary acts into sacraments of intention. Her faith thus permeated every aspect of daily life, not confined to chapel walls, but extending to the governance of the empire itself. In meetings with ministers or foreign envoys, she carried within her the calm authority of one whose spirit was anchored in prayer. To those around her, her serenity appeared as natural grace, though it was in fact the fruit of discipline. The queen's confessor occupied a central place in this routine. Confession was not a rare event, but a regular practice, often weekly, sometimes more frequently during times of crisis or spiritual unrest. The act of confession served both as spiritual purification and psychological release. Within that private exchange, the queen could reveal doubts and burdens she concealed from all others. The confessor's counsel was not limited to moral matters, but often extended to questions of conscience that touched politics and family life. His guidance helped her navigate the tension between compassion and justice, between personal conviction and public responsibility. The intimacy of confession gave her strength to bear the loneliness of her position. It was the one space where she could speak without pretense, unmasked by protocol or expectation. Relics held a place of deep significance in the daily devotional world of Habsburg queens. These sacred objects, believed to carry the presence of saints, served as both spiritual and emotional companions. Each queen had a personal collection, carefully arranged within her private oratory. Some relics were inherited from mothers or grandmothers, linking her to a lineage of faith. Others were gifts from popes, bishops, or fellow royals, carrying political symbolism as well as sanctity. Touching or kissing these relics at moments of decision or distress was a tangible way of invoking divine intercession. The physicality of such devotion reflected a theology that valued the unity of body and spirit, of matter and grace. The relic was not a mere symbol, but a bridge between earth and heaven. Relics also embodied memory. A small fragment of cloth, or bone might recall the virtues of a saint whose life mirrored the queen's own aspirations. A relic of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, for instance, might inspire charity and humility. One of Saint Catherine of Siena might remind her of courage and counsel. Through these associations, the queen found models for her own conduct. In times of grief, especially after the loss of a child or husband, relics offered solace by connecting personal sorrow to the larger narrative of divine providence. The presence of these sacred tokens within her private space gave her a sense of continuity amid the instability of court life. Religious art functioned in a similar way, combining aesthetic pleasure with spiritual reflection. The walls of the queen's chambers and chapels were adorned with paintings and sculptures that illustrated the mysteries of faith. These images were not decorative, but meditative. They invited contemplation, shaping thought and emotion. A painting of the Annunciation reminded her of obedience and trust. A crucifix taught endurance. An image of the Virgin with the child recalled maternal compassion. The act of gazing upon sacred art became a form of prayer. Many queens spent long periods in silent meditation before such images, finding in them both peace and instruction. Art transformed their private rooms into spaces of continual reflection, where beauty and belief intertwined. The orderliness of these devotions provided psychological stability. The predictability of prayer and ritual countered the chaos of politics. In a court filled with rivalry and uncertainty, the rhythm of faith offered constancy. Each prayer, each gesture, reaffirmed a sense of purpose and identity. The queens often described their spiritual life as an anchor in stormy seas. Their letters and diaries, when they survive, reveal an acute awareness of how fragile power could be. Yet within the chapel, surrounded by candles and relics, they felt grounded in a realm beyond temporal change. Devotion became a sanctuary where they could gather strength before re-entering the demands of courtly life. The personal chapels of the queens were not only sites of private worship, but also expressions of authority. The architecture, decoration, and furnishings reflected both their piety and their power. The choice of marble, the arrangement of the altar, the selection of relics, all conveyed a message about the queen's role as protector and exemplar of faith. The chapel served as a physical manifestation of the moral order she upheld. It was here that she received communion, celebrated feast days, and sometimes hosted private masses for favored attendants or visiting clerics. The intimacy of these ceremonies fostered a sense of community grounded in devotion rather than hierarchy. Within those walls, rank was softened by shared reverence. Evenings brought another round of prayer, reflection, and reading. The queen might retire early to her private oratory, accompanied only by her confessor or a trusted lady-in-waiting. Candles flickered before the altar as she reviewed the day in silence. The examen of conscience, a practice encouraged by Jesuit spirituality, guided her thoughts. She recalled her actions and intentions, acknowledged faults, and offered them to divine mercy. This nightly ritual was an act of humility and renewal, ensuring that no day ended without reconciliation. It allowed her to rest in peace, her mind unburdened by regret or anxiety. In this way, the cycle of devotion encompassed both beginning and end, sunrise and sunset, encompassing the full measure of her existence. Music often accompanied her spiritual life. Hymns, psalms, and sacred compositions enriched the atmosphere of devotion. Many queens supported court musicians who composed masses and motets for their chapels. Music was understood as a form of prayer that transcended language, a way of lifting the heart toward the divine. The harmony of voices mirrored the harmony of heaven. Listening to sacred music provided emotional release and reinforced the spiritual focus of her day. It also served a political purpose, as the beauty of worship reflected the glory of the empire's faith. The queen's patronage of music thus united personal piety with cultural prestige. The queen's rituals extended beyond the private sphere to acts of charity and intercession. Each morning, after prayer and mass, she might receive petitions from the poor, widows, or orphanages seeking assistance. Her almsgiving was part of her daily devotion, a tangible expression of compassion. These acts of mercy were not random but organized, often supervised by confessors or chaplains who ensured that aid reached those most in need. Charity linked her spiritual life to the material welfare of her subjects. It reminded her that faith demanded action. Through generosity, she embodied the virtues she contemplated in prayer. For her people, the queen's charity was proof of divine benevolence manifest in human form. Religious fasting and abstinence were other practices woven into her daily discipline. Even within the luxuries of court life, the queen observed days of restraint, abstaining from rich food or entertainment. Such acts of self-denial served as reminders of mortality and humility. They balanced the opulence of her surroundings with spiritual simplicity. The tension between splendor and self-restraint was a defining feature of Habsburg devotion. By practicing moderation in private, the queen demonstrated mastery over the temptations that accompanied privilege. Her example set a standard for the moral tone of the court, reinforcing the idea that true nobility resided in virtue rather than luxury. Personal tragedy often deepened rather than diminished the queen's devotion. The death of a child, the illness of a husband, or the collapse of political hopes tested their faith, yet also strengthened it. In grief, they turned more intensely to ritual. Vigils, masses for the dead, and extended periods of meditation became means of endurance. The chapel became a place of mourning and solace. Candles burned for lost loved ones, prayers for the departed blended with pleas for acceptance. Through these practices, sorrow was transfigured into compassion. Many queens responded to tragedy by increasing their charitable works, founding hospitals or convents as living memorials. Their faith gave structure to their grief, transforming pain into purpose. The relationship between devotion and political stability was reciprocal. The queen's visible piety reassured subjects of divine favor, while her private prayers sought strength for governance. Religious practice was not escapism but engagement. Each ritual reinforced the conviction that the monarchy operated under divine providence. The queen's personal holiness was seen as essential to the well-being of the realm. Her prayers for victory, peace, or fertility were part of the moral economy of empire. Subjects believed that her intercession could draw down blessings upon the land. In this sense, her daily devotions were not isolated acts, but contributions to the spiritual governance of the state. Pilgrimages also formed part of the rhythm of their spiritual life. Though less frequent than daily rituals, they were moments of profound renewal. When illness, crisis, or thanksgiving prompted a journey to a shrine, the queen traveled with solemn dignity, accompanied by clergy and attendants. The act of pilgrimage symbolized humility before God and solidarity with ordinary believers. It also reinforced the bond between ruler and realm, as she prayed at shrines within her own territories. Upon return, relics or sacred objects from the pilgrimage were added to her collection, extending the geography of her faith into her private sanctuary. These journeys balanced the confinement of court life with the freedom of spiritual movement. The cumulative effect of these daily and occasional rituals was the creation of an interior world that paralleled and sustained the external world of politics. In that interior world, the queen exercised sovereignty over herself. Her devotions were acts of governance in miniature, ordering the soul as the empire ordered its provinces. The chapel, the relic, the prayer book, the music, and the confessor were instruments of that order. They maintained coherence in a life of constant scrutiny and demand. Through them, the queen transformed private discipline into public virtue. Her ability to appear composed and gracious amid turmoil was not innate serenity, but cultivated spirituality. The evening often concluded with reading from scripture or devotional literature. Works of the saints, meditations on Christ's suffering, or reflections on divine providence offered both instruction and consolation. Some queens copied passages that resonated with their experience into personal notebooks, creating anthologies of wisdom that traveled with them throughout life. These readings reminded them that even the powerful were subject to divine will, that humility was the highest form of strength. In the quiet of her chamber, the queen returned to the innocence of her childhood faith, bridging the distance between the girl who learned to pray in her mother's presence and the sovereign who now prayed for nations. The continuity of ritual across the years gave her life coherence. No matter how turbulent politics became, the structure of her day remained unchanged. Morning prayer, mass, acts of charity, confession, reflection, and evening examination of conscience. This repetition did not breed monotony but serenity. Each act renewed her sense of purpose. In a world where loyalties shifted and power faltered, the constancy of devotion reminded her of a truth beyond change. Faith, disciplined through daily practice, became the foundation of her endurance. In the silence of her chapel, surrounded by relics that carried the memories of saints and ancestors, the queen found the only form of power that could not be taken from her, the sovereignty of the spirit. The rituals that framed her days were not chains of obligation, but instruments of freedom, releasing her from the tyranny of circumstance. Through prayer and reflection, she mastered the art of living with dignity in a world that often demanded submission. Her faith was both armor and compass, protecting her from despair and guiding her toward compassion. Thus, the daily life of a Habsburg queen was a sacred choreography, every movement imbued with meaning. The rhythm of prayer and ritual transformed existence into a continuous act of worship. The chapel, the relic, the mass, and the confession were the invisible pillars that supported the visible crown. In these routines, she reconciled the contradictions of her position: power and restraint, majesty and humility, solitude and responsibility. Through devotion, she turned her private world into a mirror of divine order. And within that mirror, she discovered the true measure of sovereignty, the ability to rule not only an empire but oneself. The daily rituals of devotion that shaped the inner world of the Habsburg queens did not end within the walls of the chapel. Their prayers, their faith, and their moral convictions inevitably reached outward, influencing the policies of the empire itself. For women who stood at the center of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, faith could never be confined to the personal. It was interwoven with diplomacy, dynastic interest, and the maintenance of power. The act of praying was both an expression of submission to God and an assertion of spiritual authority. Through piety, the queens carved a space of influence in a world dominated by men. They transformed devotion into a language of governance, using faith as a means to shape policy, guide alliances, and mold the moral identity of the empire. From early morning prayers to audiences with ambassadors, the spiritual and the political merged seamlessly in the life of a Habsburg queen. Her religious convictions informed how she interpreted duty, justice, and mercy. Every decision, whether concerning a royal marriage, a treaty, or the appointment of bishops, was filtered through the lens of conscience. The habit of reflection that daily devotion encouraged allowed her to discern moral dimensions in political acts. This gave her a distinct form of authority, not based on rank or force, but on the perception of sanctity. A queen's visible piety lent legitimacy to her counsel and moral weight to her influence. Ministers and diplomats knew that to appeal to her sense of faith was to access one of the most powerful forces in the court. Within the political culture of the Habsburg monarchy, religion was both the foundation of legitimacy and the instrument of unity. The monarch ruled by divine right, and the queen, as consort, embodied the moral conscience of that rule. Her piety, when publicly expressed, reassured subjects of divine favor. When expressed in council, it shaped decisions that would affect kingdoms and colonies alike. Many queens acted as mediators between the church and the crown, ensuring that imperial ambition did not conflict with religious principle. Their intervention was often subtle, framed in the language of moral persuasion rather than command. Yet the results were profound. A single conversation in a private chapel, a letter written to a papal envoy, or the selection of a confessor could alter the course of policy. One of the most striking features of Habsburg queenship was how faith functioned as a bridge between private devotion and public duty. Prayer did not simply precede action, it directed it. When a queen knelt before the altar to seek guidance, her petitions often concerned matters of state. She prayed for peace in the empire, for victory in war, for the conversion of heretics, or for the success of diplomatic marriages. These were not abstract requests but practical expressions of policy, framed as acts of faith. In this way, prayer became a political tool, legitimizing decisions by aligning them with divine will. The perception that the Queen's counsel was guided by God strengthened her influence over emperors and ministers who valued the sanctity of conscience as much as the strategy of power. The Counter-Reformation provided the clearest stage for this blending of piety and politics. The Habsburgs stood as the principal defenders of Catholic orthodoxy in an age of confessional conflict. Queens within the dynasty played essential roles in sustaining this religious identity. Their personal devotion, their patronage of new religious orders, and their commitment to education and conversion gave tangible form to the empire's spiritual mission. These women were not merely supporters of the Counter-Reformation, they were its living symbols. Through them, faith acquired a human face that inspired loyalty and reverence among subjects. The queens promoted the work of the Jesuits, the Capuchins, and other reforming orders, recognizing that these groups combined spiritual renewal with intellectual discipline and missionary zeal. By supporting the foundation of Jesuit colleges, convents, and seminaries, they strengthened the moral fabric of society while reinforcing the political unity of the empire. Patronage was never purely devotional, it was strategic. Each convent founded under royal protection became a bastion of loyalty, a center where faith and allegiance converged. These foundations also served to educate women, train confessors, and prepare missionaries who would carry the imperial religion across the seas. Thus, the Queen's acts of charity became instruments of empire. Their influence on imperial policy extended beyond patronage to direct counsel. The queens were often trusted advisors on questions of religious toleration, clerical appointments, and diplomatic alliances with other Catholic powers. Their familiarity with spiritual matters allowed them to speak with a moral authority that few men in court could challenge. When questions arose concerning the enforcement of religious conformity, their voices were often decisive in determining whether the empire would proceed with severity or moderation. The balance they struck between zeal and prudence reflected both their personal spirituality and their awareness of political realities. Marriage alliances were among the most significant ways in which faith influenced politics. Dynastic unions were not only matters of blood, but also of belief. A queen's insistence on marrying her children to devout Catholic princes rather than Protestant ones often altered the map of Europe. Through such decisions, she reinforced the religious identity of the dynasty and ensured that future generations would continue to uphold Catholic orthodoxy. The role of a queen mother in arranging marriages was both maternal and political. Guided by spiritual conviction, she viewed these unions as acts of divine service, intended to preserve the faith within her house and extend its influence beyond its borders. The Queen's correspondence reveals the moral tension inherent in such responsibilities. Letters to confessors and relatives show that they were acutely aware of the consequences of their choices. To refuse a politically advantageous alliance with a Protestant ruler could risk war. To accept it could endanger the soul of the family. In navigating such dilemmas, they relied on prayer, consultation, and conscience. Their ability to harmonize faith with diplomacy demonstrated a subtle understanding of power. The recognition that true authority lies not only in conquest, but also in moral integrity. The Counter-Reformation was as much a cultural movement as a theological one, and the Queen's patronage of the arts reflected their participation in this campaign. Religious art, architecture, and music sponsored by them carried messages of divine order, virtue, and obedience. By commissioning altarpieces, chapels, and devotional paintings, they promoted both aesthetic refinement and doctrinal clarity. Each visual expression of faith became a political statement. The grandeur of a chapel or the solemnity of a religious procession affirmed the vitality of Catholicism and, by extension, the legitimacy of Habsburg rule. In this way, the Queen's taste in art contributed to the ideological fabric of the empire. The Queens also took an active interest in missionary work, both within Europe and overseas. They understood the expansion of the faith as an extension of imperial destiny. Supporting missions in the New World and in Asia was not only a spiritual act, but also a form of statecraft. Their donations funded churches, schools, and hospitals in distant lands, projecting the image of the Habsburg monarchy as the champion of Christendom. The letters and reports they received from missionaries connected the palace with the frontiers of faith, reinforcing the sense that the Queen's prayer extended to the ends of the earth. Yet the use of piety as a political tool required delicate balance. The same devotion that inspired unity could also provoke division. Within the Habsburg family itself, differences in temperament and belief sometimes led to tension. A queen's confessor, if too zealous or influential, could become a source of controversy. Courtiers resented the intrusion of religious advisors into matters of state, while ministers feared that decisions made in confessionals might outweigh those reached in councils. The queen had to navigate these suspicions carefully, ensuring that her influence appeared moral rather than manipulative. Her power lay in discretion. The more she presented her interventions as the natural fruit of conscience, the more effective they became. The Queen's influence in religious matters also risked alienating non-Catholic subjects. The empire contained a vast diversity of faiths, and while the Habsburg monarchs sought to restore religious unity, excessive zeal could threaten political stability. Queens who championed reform had to temper enthusiasm with prudence. They learned to use persuasion rather than coercion, charity rather than condemnation. Their acts of patronage often served to convert through example rather than force. By embodying virtue, they offered a model of faith that attracted rather than repelled. This soft power of sanctity complemented the harder policies of enforcement pursued by male rulers. Within the court, the Queen's Chapel functioned as both a place of prayer and a stage for diplomacy. Ambassadors attended masses celebrated in her presence, observing not only ritual but also hierarchy. The placement of dignitaries, the sequence of prayers, the selection of hymns, all carried symbolic weight. When she prayed publicly for peace after a battle or thanksgiving after a treaty, her gestures reinforced the connection between divine favor and political success. The liturgy thus became a language of statecraft. In the solemn rhythm of worship, politics found sacred form. A queen's intercession with the church often determined appointments to bishoprics and abbeys, giving her indirect influence over the clergy and their allegiance. Through confession, she learned of men's moral fitness for office. Through patronage, she rewarded loyalty. This informal network of influence strengthened the crown's control over the church while preserving the illusion of ecclesiastical independence. The cooperation between throne and altar was embodied in the person of the queen, who stood between them as mediator and guarantor. The personal example of holiness carried immense political weight. In an age when rulers claimed divine sanction, a queen who lived visibly according to Christian virtue reinforced the sacred aura of monarchy. Her chastity, charity, and humility were not private virtues but public instruments. They demonstrated that power could coexist with piety, authority with compassion. The people, seeing in her a model of Christian womanhood, were more inclined to view the monarchy as an instrument of divine order. The cult of royal sanctity, nurtured by tales of miraculous healings or answered prayers, further enhanced this perception. Faith became propaganda, but of a kind rooted in genuine conviction. The Queen's involvement in education extended their influence over future generations. By supporting seminaries, schools, and convents, they shaped the moral and intellectual formation of clergy and laity alike. These institutions not only propagated Catholic doctrine, but also trained administrators and missionaries loyal to the empire. The blending of religion and learning served both church and state. The Queen's role as patron of education reinforced her image as mother of the nation, nurturing both souls and subjects. Her visits to schools and convents were acts of governance as much as of devotion. In moments of political crisis, queens often assumed the role of intercessor. Their pleas for mercy on behalf of rebels, prisoners, or condemned heretics softened the harshness of justice and reflected the Christian virtue of compassion. Such interventions strengthened the moral legitimacy of the regime. They showed that even in enforcing orthodoxy, the monarchy remained guided by conscience rather than cruelty. The Queen's ability to temper power with pity became a political resource, helping to maintain loyalty among diverse populations. The balance between zeal and tolerance was never easy to maintain. Some queens were criticized for excessive piety, accused of allowing confessors to rule through them. Others were condemned for compromise, suspected of weakening the church's authority. The truth lay in the complexity of their position. They operated in a world where religion defined identity and allegiance, where the salvation of souls was inseparable from the fate of states. Their challenge was to maintain spiritual integrity without jeopardizing political stability. In meeting this challenge, they revealed the subtlety of their intelligence and the depth of their faith. Faith also provided a language through which the queens could articulate political ideals. The metaphors of divine order, harmony, and justice guided their understanding of governance. They conceived the empire as a reflection of celestial hierarchy, where each member fulfilled a role within a greater design. This vision gave moral coherence to policies of expansion and consolidation. It justified authority not as arbitrary power, but as stewardship entrusted by God. The Queen, as moral guide of the sovereign, ensured that this vision remained alive amid the compromises of realpolitik. Her role in shaping the empire's religious identity extended to the domestic sphere as well. Court rituals, family devotions, and religious festivals organized under her supervision modeled behavior for the aristocracy. Nobles imitated the Queen's piety, sponsoring their own chapels, supporting charitable works, and educating their children within the faith. Thus, her influence radiated outward from the palace, infusing the nobility with the same sense of mission that animated the dynasty. In time, this spiritual culture permeated society, binding the empire through shared belief and practice. The Queen's relationship with the papacy illustrated the complexity of their role. They were loyal daughters of the Church, yet also protectors of imperial prerogative. Their correspondence with popes and cardinals reveals a tone of respectful independence. They sought papal blessings for their foundations, but they also defended the crown's rights against ecclesiastical encroachment. Their diplomacy within the church mirrored their diplomacy within the state, patient, persuasive, and grounded in conscience. By maintaining this balance, they preserved both the authority of Rome and the autonomy of the empire. The enduring power of the Queen's faith lay in its authenticity. It was not merely a posture adopted for political advantage, but a conviction that shaped every aspect of life. This sincerity gave credibility to their influence. Even adversaries recognized the integrity of their devotion. The effectiveness of their piety as a political lever depended precisely on its truthfulness. People believed in their holiness, and that belief translated into trust and obedience. Their faith united what politics alone could not: hearts and minds. As the years passed and new generations rose, the legacy of these queens endured in the institutions they founded and the moral tone they set. The convents, schools, and churches that bore their patronage became monuments to a vision of rulership rooted in faith. The missionaries they supported carried the empire's spiritual mission to new worlds. The harmony they sought between devotion and governance shaped the ethos of the Habsburg monarchy long after their deaths. In the final analysis, the Habsburg queens exemplified a unique synthesis of prayer and politics. Their piety was neither escapism nor ornament, but an instrument of power and stability. Through faith, they transformed influence into vocation and authority into service. Their prayers were not whispered retreat, but active engagement with the destiny of an empire. In them, the private and the public, the sacred and the political, converged into a single calling. Their lives remind us that power, when guided by conscience, becomes not domination but stewardship, and that faith, when joined with wisdom, can shape history as profoundly as any army or law. The influence of the Habsburg queens did not vanish with their deaths. Their piety, expressed through daily devotion, charitable work, and political insight, left a legacy that shaped not only their dynasty but the moral and cultural landscape of Europe. Their lives stood at the intersection of faith and authority, private conscience and public duty. The habits they cultivated, the institutions they founded, and the ideals they embodied continued to define the spiritual identity of the Habsburg realm long after their own voices were silenced. The world they helped create was one where religion and rulership remained inseparable, where the image of a queen in prayer still evoked the strength of empire. Their influence was lasting because it was both personal and institutional. The children they raised, the confessors they appointed, and the courtiers they inspired carried their convictions into subsequent generations. Their sons and daughters learned from them not only etiquette and diplomacy, but also the moral discipline of a ruler who viewed power as service. The next generation of emperors, empresses, and archduchesses inherited a sense of divine responsibility that traced its roots to the pious example of their mothers and grandmothers. The rhythm of devotion that once governed a queen's day, morning prayer, mass, charity, reflection, became an enduring pattern in courtly life, passed on as a form of cultural memory. This transmission of piety was not a matter of imitation alone. It evolved with time, adapting to changing political realities and theological debates, yet it retained the core principles of humility, duty, and faithfulness that the early Habsburg queens had established. Their personal devotions became public traditions, woven into the ceremonial life of the court. The celebration of feast days, the foundation of convents, and the sponsorship of pilgrimages all reflected their enduring imprint. Even as political circumstances shifted, their examples served as a model for how power could be sanctified by conscience. Their successors continued to draw upon that moral inheritance, seeing in their lives a guide for how to balance spiritual conviction with temporal authority. The legacy of these women was especially evident in the resilience of the Habsburg religious identity. Throughout centuries of upheaval, the wars of religion, the rise of Enlightenment skepticism, and the slow secularization of European politics, the dynasty remained a bastion of Catholic faith. This steadfastness owed much to the memory of queens who had demonstrated that piety and policy could reinforce rather than undermine one another. The institutions they nurtured became the guardians of that tradition. Convents they founded continued to educate the daughters of nobility. Chapels they endowed remained centers of prayer. Charitable foundations they established endured as symbols of royal mercy. Their spirituality had become a living structure within the body of the empire. The endurance of their influence was also rooted in the way they shaped perceptions of queenship itself. In an age when political theory and social custom confined women to secondary roles, the Habsburg queens expanded the boundaries of female agency. They did not overthrow patriarchy, nor did they seek open rebellion against the conventions of their time. Instead, they worked within the structures available to them, turning piety into power. By embodying the virtues that society demanded of women, modesty, obedience, compassion, they gained the moral authority to influence decisions that shaped kingdoms. Their genius lay in transforming expectation into opportunity. What appeared as submission was often strategy. What seemed like passivity concealed persuasion. This subtle form of power challenged the simplistic image of queens as ornamental figures or instruments of dynastic exchange. Too often, history has portrayed them as silent partners in the political dramas of their husbands and sons. The reality was far more complex. Their faith provided them with a platform from which to speak with moral credibility. Within the patriarchal court, where political speech was often the privilege of men, the voice of conscience carried through prayer and counsel. The queen's words, uttered in the confessional or the chapel, could shape the conscience of kings. Their influence was not proclaimed but enacted, not codified in law but embedded in custom and respect. Modern interpretations have sometimes dismissed this kind of influence as merely symbolic, but to do so is to misunderstand the nature of power in early modern Europe. Authority was not only exercised through edicts or armies, but through belief and example. The moral tone of the court, the sanctity of its ceremonies, and the legitimacy of its policies all depended on the conviction that the monarchy was guided by divine will. The queens embodied that conviction. They were living assurances that the empire's grandeur rested on moral foundation. Their private prayers were as significant to the maintenance of power as the decrees of ministers or the victories of generals. The persistence of their legacy can also be traced through art, literature, and collective memory. Painters and chroniclers depicted them not as passive consorts, but as models of Christian virtue. Portraits of queens in prayer, surrounded by symbols of faith and charity, circulated throughout Europe, reinforcing the association between holiness and sovereignty. These images were not mere propaganda. They reflected genuine admiration for women whose piety had become synonymous with stability. In a continent divided by religious conflict, the sight of a devout queen kneeling before an altar offered reassurance that the empire remained under divine protection. Even long after their deaths, these visual representations kept their spiritual presence alive in the imagination of subjects and rulers alike. The institutions they founded became enduring monuments to their faith. Convents, hospitals, and churches bore their names, perpetuating their memory through the daily prayers of those who lived and worked there. Within these spaces, their portraits hung alongside relics and devotional art, reminding future generations of their patronage and virtue. These foundations often served as refuges for widows, orphans, and the poor, living embodiments of the charity they practiced. Their role in sustaining education and healthcare reflected a deep understanding that spiritual and social welfare were inseparable. Through such institutions, their piety became part of the social fabric, reaching far beyond the confines of court. The impact of their spirituality also shaped the historiography of monarchy itself. The image of the pious queen influenced how later generations understood the moral dimension of rulership. Historians, theologians, and political theorists alike drew upon their example to argue that legitimate power required moral integrity. Their lives provided evidence that authority, when guided by conscience, could serve both God and people. Even critics of monarchy, who rejected hereditary rule, often acknowledged the ethical force of such figures. The enduring fascination with their character lies precisely in this paradox, that within systems built on hierarchy and exclusion, they managed to embody compassion, wisdom, and faith. The Habsburg Queen's legacy also invites a reconsideration of how female power operated in pre-modern Europe. Their influence was neither loud nor revolutionary, but it was profound. By mastering the language of devotion, they entered the most sacred and therefore the most authoritative sphere of their society. Their spiritual credibility granted them access to moral and political decision-making from which other women were excluded. They proved that in a world governed by men, holiness could be a woman's form of sovereignty. Their example demonstrates that faith, far from being a retreat from politics, was a means of participation in it. Through piety, They negotiated space for agency, turning prayer into policy and conscience into counsel. Their enduring impact also lies in the way they reconciled power with virtue. In the history of monarchy, rulers often faced the dilemma of reconciling ambition with morality. The Habsburg queens offered a model for how authority could be exercised without corruption, how influence could coexist with humility. Their faith did not blind them to political realities. Rather, it provided a framework within which to navigate them. The discipline of prayer trained them to deliberate, to discern, and to act with purpose. Their example demonstrated that governance could be an act of service, that compassion could coexist with command. In an age when many rulers sought glory through conquest, they pursued sanctity through stewardship. Their influence extended even to the reform of religious life itself. By supporting the renewal of convents and the foundation of new orders, they helped revitalize Catholic spirituality at a critical moment in European history. The Counter-Reformation, with its emphasis on interior devotion and moral reform, found in these queens its most effective advocates. Their personal holiness lent credibility to the movement's ideals. The nuns and priests they supported carried those ideals into the wider world, ensuring that the spiritual revival they championed would endure long after the dynastic politics that had given it context faded. Thus, their legacy was not confined to the temporal sphere, but extended into the ongoing evolution of Christian thought and practice. The myth of the powerless queen dissolves when examined against the evidence of their lives. Their correspondence, foundations, and enduring institutions testify to a quiet but deliberate exercise of authority. They did not wield swords or command armies, but they governed hearts and consciences. They operated within the constraints of their gender and position, yet within those boundaries they exercised remarkable creativity. The spiritual strategies they employed, patronage, persuasion, example, proved more enduring than the fleeting triumphs of battle or diplomacy. Their success was measured not in conquered lands, but in converted hearts, not in decrees, but in devotion. To understand their legacy fully, one must recognize how it reshaped the concept of monarchy itself. The Habsburg court, through their influence, became not merely a center of political power, but a stage for moral leadership. The blending of faith and rule gave the empire a sense of divine mission that distinguished it from its rivals. Even when the fortunes of the dynasty waned, that sense of sacred responsibility persisted. The queens had transformed the idea of sovereignty from domination to stewardship, from command to care. Their faith humanized the institution of monarchy, infusing it with compassion and conscience. Their example also had implications beyond the boundaries of their own dynasty. The model of the devout queen spread across Europe, influencing the behavior and expectations of other royal courts. Catholic consorts in France, Spain, and the Italian states adopted similar patterns of devotion and patronage. Even Protestant queens, though differing in theology, imitated the moral discipline and charitable work of their Habsburg counterparts. The idea that a queen could serve as the moral center of the state became a fixture of European political culture. In this sense, their legacy transcended confession and geography, shaping the ideals of queenship for generations. The persistence of their spiritual image in art and memory also reveals how society continued to seek moral exemplars within the structures of power. In times of political corruption or social unrest, chroniclers looked back to the pious queens as symbols of integrity. Their lives were invoked in sermons and literature as reminders that faith could guide governance. Their memory served as a moral compass, not only for monarchs but for subjects who desired leaders of conscience. The reverence they inspired was not based on myth alone, but on the tangible evidence of their works and words. The convents that still bore their names, the hospitals that still cared for the poor, and the prayers still said in their honor testified to a legacy both spiritual and material. Debunking the myth of their passivity also requires acknowledging the emotional and intellectual depth of their spirituality. Their faith was not mere superstition or ritual compliance. It was reflective, disciplined, and informed by the theological debates of their age. Many of them corresponded with theologians, read devotional literature, and engaged in spiritual exercises designed to cultivate discernment. Their understanding of prayer was active, combining contemplation with responsibility. This intellectual engagement elevated their piety beyond personal salvation to a vision of collective redemption. They saw the empire not just as a political entity, but as a moral community under divine guidance. The endurance of their example suggests that their form of agency, rooted in conscience rather than coercion, remains relevant. In a world where power often corrupts, their lives offer a reminder that moral conviction can be a source of strength rather than weakness. Their legacy challenges the modern tendency to separate spirituality from politics, private belief from public action. They demonstrate that faith, when sincerely lived, can inform governance with justice and compassion. Understanding their private devotions, their confessions, and their acts of charity allows for a deeper comprehension of how monarchical power functioned not only as control but as care. Their spiritual legacy also sheds light on the continuity of moral ideals within changing historical contexts. Even as Europe moved toward secular governance, the memory of pious rulers continued to shape expectations of leadership. The ideal of the ruler guided by conscience, the sovereign who acts in humility before God, owes much to the precedent set by these queens. Their influence persisted not because they clung to the past, but because they articulated values that transcended it. Their emphasis on duty, charity, and integrity spoke to universal truths about human responsibility. In this sense, their legacy is not confined to the history of monarchy, but extends into the broader history of ethics and leadership. In reflecting on their lives, one cannot separate the personal from the political, the sacred from the secular. Their faith was the lens through which they viewed the world, and through that lens they perceived power as a form of stewardship. The daily acts of devotion that seemed private were in fact acts of governance, for they sustained the moral equilibrium of the court and the empire. Their prayers for peace, justice, and mercy were not abstract hopes but guiding principles for policy. The empire they helped to shape was not merely a political entity, but a moral project, a community bound together by belief as much as by law. Their deaths did not end their influence. The institutions they founded continued their mission. Their example inspired later generations of queens who faced similar challenges of conscience and power. Even in periods of decline, when the empire's authority weakened, the memory of their holiness provided a moral anchor. They had demonstrated that true sovereignty lies not in domination but in self-mastery, not in command but in compassion. Their lives remind us that history is not shaped only by armies and treaties, but by the quiet strength of those who pray and persevere. To understand the Habsburg queens is to understand the spiritual foundation of monarchy itself. Their faith reveals that power, at its most enduring, is moral before it is political. The empire they helped sustain was held together as much by belief as by blood. Their example compels us to reconsider the nature of influence, to see in devotion a form of strategy, and in humility a form of authority. They teach that leadership, when rooted in conscience, can bridge the distance between heaven and earth, between ruler and subject. The crown, in their hands, became a symbol not only of dominion but of duty. The legacy of the pious queens lies in their fusion of inward grace with outward strength. They embodied a vision of power tempered by faith, authority balanced by mercy. Through their prayers, they shaped policy. Through their charity, they softened justice. Through their faith, they sustained an empire. Their lives stand as testimony to the enduring truth that the most lasting empires are those built not merely on conquest, but on conscience. The Habsburg queens remind us that the heart of sovereignty is not the throne, but the soul that sits upon it.